Thanks very much. And we're very pleased to have with us today as our guest Afshan Khan, the UNICEF Regional Director for Europe and Central Asia. And she is here to provide an update on how children are being affected by the conflict in Ukraine. And she just returned from a mission there last week. Ms. Khan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and it's really a pleasure to be here with you all. I spent last week in Ukraine, very much meeting with children and families affected by the war, seeing part of the critical humanitarian response, meeting with authorities, UN colleagues, and partner organizations. I was able to visit Kiev, Irpin, Busha, Zhytomyr, and Lviv. And I think the time I spent in the country provided a clear view of the huge impact of the war that Ukraine continues to have on children, both inside and outside the country. And also, all of you have seen the longer-term impacts in the region and across the globe. First and foremost, I think we've got to be clear that the numbers are staggering, and they bear repeating. Nearly 2/3 of Ukraine's children are displaced, whether displaced inside the country or those who have fled across borders as refugees. And children have been forced to leave homes, friends, toys, treasured belongings, family members, and many of them alone with their mothers facing uncertainty about their futures. According to the latest figures from colleagues in OHCHR, 275 children have been killed, with another 451 children injured, mostly due to explosives that have been used in urban areas. So again, the use of explosive weapons in populated areas and attacks on civilian infrastructure clearly must stop. It's killing and maiming children and preventing them from returning to any sense of normal life in their towns, in their cities, and in their homes. And I've seen a number of children, even young children, severely traumatized by what they've witnessed. There have been at least 256 attacks on healthcare facilities, and 1 in 6 UNICEF-supported safe schools in the east of the country have been damaged or destroyed. We're increasingly concerned about the situation with access to safe water, with at least 1.4 million in the east cut off from running water, and many of you would have seen reports about watery diarrhea in Mariupol and some of the surrounding areas. As these numbers show, the war in Ukraine is clearly a child rights crisis, and UNICEF is working tirelessly to support children and families wherever they are in country. The critical role of UNICEF in Ukraine is reflected in the recent agreement signed with government extending our program of collaboration until the end of 2023 as part of the UN's transitional framework. UNICEF has been in Ukraine for more than 25 years, so we have a long-standing relationship with municipalities, with partners, with governments, with civil society. After more than 3.5 months of war, UNICEF and partners are taking stock of the humanitarian response so far and directing efforts in the next period to those most in need. I think with the escalation of the conflict, there's severe issues to deal with protection of children and families. And while to date, inside Ukraine, UNICEF has reached over 2 million people with health supplies and access to safe drinking water, more than 600,000 children and caregivers have received mental health and psychosocial support, and more than 180,000 children have been engaged in formal and community-based learning. The needs are exorbitant and huge. We have partners on both sides of the contact line who work to reach children with critical information and life-saving supplies and services. And we've activated rapid response missions in the east of the country, closest to the line of contact and the fighting. And as a result, we've been able to date to assist 100 families in shelters closest to the front line and in the hardest to reach locations. These decentralized rapid response teams and our expansion into the more difficult parts of the country have been the bulwark of our current emphasis and response. However, despite intensive efforts to ensure safe, rapid, and unimpeded humanitarian access, significant challenges remain to the most affected areas across the country. And we're continuing to call on all parties for safe, unfettered access to reach children wherever they may be. In central and western parts of the country where things are slightly more stable, we've provided services and support to strengthen local authorities that are still operating and functioning in these zones. So one example is the Spilno, Together, the Child Spots, where are places which parents and children can go to access support services, including therapy and psychosocial support, gain access to information on where to register if they're internally displaced. Children have a safe space to play, and there's a possibility to sit with other parents and gain some brief and guided support, including where you can immunize your child and where you can access health services. So we've had more than 100 of these centers now across Ukraine. And we really, when I saw them, they were an immediate service for many children and families, and a one-stop shop. So in that sense, in Busha, where the staff estimated that half of the children attending required psychosocial support, I think we cannot underestimate the mental health needs and the trauma faced by many of these children. So these Spilno centers are a first spot to be able to meet, talk, and do some form of triage. In Irpin, I visited 2 schools damaged in the fighting, putting the education of almost 2,000 children at risk. The new school year begins in September, and while we don't have verified figures for the exact number of damaged schools in the country, the figure is likely to be in the thousands. First of all, because we've seen shelling and attacks against schools, but secondly, because it's often a source for many internally displaced people to seek shelter in those schools. So repairing schools will be a priority for UNICEF and the government, so children can return early in September to some form of safe blended learning. And really we see this not just for the learning opportunities, but also for the psychosocial support that's needed for children with peers, teachers, and some sense of return to normalcy. Thanks to the generous support of governments, companies, and individuals, we can continue to support our work inside Ukraine and across the region where refugees have sought shelter, including cash assistance to extremely vulnerable families. We see this as a very, very important component of the response. But ultimately, as many of you know, all of these interventions aren't going to be sufficient if there isn't peace. So we continue to call for an immediate ceasefire in Ukraine to protect all children from harm. And we recognize that every day that this war is continuing, it's increasing the long-lasting, devastating impact on children in Ukraine, in the region, and across the world. So ultimately, we see that all we can do right now is provide temporary respite, but what is really needed is a cessation of the hostilities and a peaceful return for children to be able to get back to some sense of normalcy, where right now their futures have been shattered. So thank you, and I'm open to taking any questions that may come. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We'll open the floor to your questions. First question goes to Valeria.
Thank you so much for this press conference on behalf of ANCA. Valeria Robecco from ANSA Newswire. My question is, do you have an idea on what the effects of the conflict on minors will be in the medium, but most the long term, in terms of access to education, in terms of trauma? I mean, what do you expect if there will not be peace soon? And also, what are the elements that worry the most? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I think, Valeria, when I've spoken to children, one of the key issues that we only have about less than 25% of the schools operational in Ukraine. And we saw, even during the period prior to the escalation of the hostilities, we were dealing with the COVID pandemic. So children then missed learning together for more than 2 years prior to that. Now, with the escalation of the war, the bombing of many schools, and the hostilities, I think we see fear by some parents of even sending their children back to school. On the other hand, we know that having children in a learning environment allows us to do some triage with children, see who needs support more, and how do we better provide that assistance. We know that learning losses can impact children longer term, and the longer they're out of school, the harder it's to go back. So I would segment it almost into two different groups. I would say the younger the child, the easier the recovery is, in a way, because they're not necessarily as exposed. For the teenagers, it's been really difficult. They know what's going on. They've often left their fathers, their brothers behind. They understand what the war means. And one of the biggest things when you're a teenager is the support of your peers. And to not have that ability to relate to other kids and not have that ability to be alongside your peer group will have a lasting impact. And then lastly, I would say one of my biggest fears is that we're unable to provide sufficient support to the recovery in the medium term because the hostilities are going to continue. And what we're seeing now in the East is more and more internally displaced people shifting to the central and western part of the country, putting a lot of pressure on basic services, whether it's education, whether it's health services, whether it's access to psychosocial support and care. So accelerating that and making sure those services are available to internally displaced is going to take a mammoth effort. We've started, we're already delivering in Bucha and Irpin, where I visited, but I think, and in Zhytomyr, and Zhytomyr is in the central part near the Belarusian border. We're going to have to continue to augment that. There's another 40,000 IDPs that will arrive there in this week, because government is helping relocate families from the contact line. But really, if there isn't peace and this war continues in the East, the numbers of displaced is putting real pressure on the available services in country.
Okay, thanks. Evelyn? Yeah, yes, yes.
I can't see you up there. Evelyn Leopold. Thank you very much for the briefing. It's frightening in many ways what's happening to children, particularly when they're targets in schools and on street and through mines. Is UNICEF, are you going to contribute at all to the information collected on war crimes? Because it seems rather criminal and perhaps officially criminal. And secondly, have you come across sexual abuse, trafficking? And thirdly, do you have any information on reports that children are being abducted to Russia?
Thank you very much, Evelyn, for the question. I think, firstly, obviously, the commissions of inquiry that are undertaken in Ukraine, it will be incredibly important to document evidence. UNICEF, through its outreach, clearly has information on damaged schools, on hospitals, and we will share that through the regular mechanisms that we always use in any conflict. I think when it comes to the issues of children who may have left to different parts of the world, monitoring that is extremely difficult. For us, we do not currently have access to the border areas with the Russian Federation. We know that it'll be extremely important to continue to work to be able to document any cases. We also know that in UNICEF across the globe, we've always insisted that in the case of conflict, no child should be put up for adoption. And it's going to be very important for us to be able to ensure that we continue to support reunification of children with their families. And that's first and foremost our priority. When it comes to the Russian Federation and many of the statements that have been made regarding children that have been sent to Russia, we're working closely to see with ombudspersons and their networks how best we can document those cases, and if there are any, to make sure that if they're legal guardians, those children are united with their families. So that will be an important part of our work at the regional level going forward. And then thirdly, I think when it comes to your point of how best do we deal with the challenges of what has happened to children as a result of this war, whether it's the hospitals and maternity wards that have been shelled, whether it's the schools, I think here the information collection is important, but equally important will be the programs that are in place to help address in the medium and to longer term the impacts on children.
But have you had evidence of sexual abuse and trafficking?
I think when it comes to sexual abuse and trafficking, there's two things to bear in mind. One, prior to the crisis or escalation of the conflict, Ukraine was the 5th largest source of women trafficked in Europe. So those networks exist already. When it comes to children per se, we've been working very closely with the surrounding countries on training of border guards so they can identify families who may be, or groups of said families who may be at risk of trafficking. We've trained border guards to identify if it looks like a child is not appropriately accompanied by an adult. And in terms of reports and documented evidence, that's still not as strong as it should be. So I think there is work to be done to be able to strengthen those monitoring mechanisms. But for UNICEF, our first point of work is on prevention, on being able to work with local NGO partners to identify. We know there's cases of sexual exploitation and abuse. Those happen in every single crisis where women are put at risk. So our role here is to help prevent those. And we know that there's other entities that will work strongly on documenting and collecting that evidence. We've already started a partnership amongst, as I said, the borders guards, but also with the police, so that there's a clear reporting and identification mechanism. And often you'll see that many families are fleeing to countries in Europe. So the national systems to be able to identify those, that's where I think our efforts come at strengthening those national systems. Because with the numbers that have fled across borders, more than 7.1 million people, it's going to be impossible for us to trace individual cases.
Okay. Yes, please.
Francesco Semprini with La Stampa. Thank you. I have two quick questions, if I may. The first one is, do you have any clue of how many children could be affected by the conflict in any different way? And my second question, did you gather any evidence of minors involved in the fighting, I mean, in the different factions fighting on the ground?
Thank you. In terms of the impact of the war on children, I would say every single child in Ukraine, their lives have been touched by this war. They've either lost a family member, they have either witnessed trauma themselves, with 2/3 of the children in the country on the move. We cannot say that a single child's life has not been touched. Now, the question is, how severely are these kids impacted? What have they witnessed in terms of killing or maiming of their family members, or whether they've fled and their home has been destroyed, whether they've lost friends. These are all things that for a child without adequate support is a recurring nightmare. But I think when it comes to the impact of war, we'll see it throughout the country in the coming months, and I think no child's life has been touched. On your second question, when it comes to children engaged in active combat, we haven't seen that. What we have perhaps seen that's very scary for younger kids is there are militias that are active. And for the boys that are 16, 17, 18, making sure that the principles of not recruiting children are upheld is going to be extremely important to maintain, including with in the non-government controlled areas in the east. There is very active conscription of all males to continue to fight. And I think that's where our work on working to make sure the principles are upheld on the Children in Armed Conflict agenda and no child is actively recruited will be extremely important.
I'm sorry, when you talk about militia from both sides or in particular from one side?
No, I'm talking about militia, particularly in the non-government controlled areas. In Ukraine, we have seen quite a discipline in the armed forces. There are obviously other groups that are working to prevent cities from coming under attack, and we've seen barricades in many places with volunteers doing things like sandbagging and creating the defense mechanisms around cities and towns, boarding up windows. So that has been a whole-scale mobilization of the entire population. But when it comes to active fighting, I think the risks are far more on the eastern side.
Abdulhamid?
Thank you, Ms. Khan. Abdulhamid Sayam from the Arabic Daily Al-Quds Al-Arabi. Thank you for the briefing and the eyewitness account of what happened in Ukraine. And I want to ask you if you can give us some comparison between the suffering of children in Ukraine with other children in other conflict areas. What is different here from like what happened in Yemen or Syria or in fact Palestine and Gaza in particular and Libya and other conflict areas? What is different here? Thank you.
Thank you. And I think thank you also for raising these other crises. I think often what we see is that a child is a child, and no child in any situation, whether it's Yemen, whether it's Syria, whether it's Gaza, should have to go through what they're going through currently. We really need a rethink of how we're shoring up the futures of our children as the next generation of leaders in this world. But coming back to your practical question, let me say two things. One, it's the speed of this crisis. So I was the humanitarian director for UNICEF globally during the Syria crisis. And obviously the lives of children inside Syria were severely impacted. But it took 4 years to reach 4 million children leaving Syria to the surrounding countries. Inside Ukraine, this happened in less than 4 weeks. We saw millions, 4 million already fleeing. Now, this may be due to the mobility and the ability of the population themselves to have the means to leave, but I think the impact on children specifically of having been uprooted from their homes, their families, their communities, their schools cannot be underestimated. So I would say it's the speed of the conflict. The second thing I would say is it's also the level of destruction. And when I went to Homs and Hama, I saw the same thing in terms of buildings, apartment buildings being severely decimated and destroyed. But the air raids and the bombings in Ukraine have not been incessant for 4 months, almost coming on to 4 months now. And we've seen damages to civilian infrastructure that's unprecedented. I think Eastern Ukraine, even prior to the escalation of the conflict in February, was almost one of the largest mine-contaminated places on Earth. So when we see now the levels of unexploded ordnances that are there, I'm really fear for the maiming of children, and I saw the same thing in Syria after the crisis with children picking up unexploited ordinances. So that's where I think, coming back to earlier points that were raised, the importance of mine risk education, the importance of clearing these areas is going to be very important. But coming back to your point, I think the suffering in the children in Ukraine is as great as the suffering in the children in Syria. And ultimately, no child should have to go through this war. So for all of us, I think we need to highlight that the impact these conflicts have on children is long-lasting, and it alters their lives forever. So the more we can do to push efforts for peace, the more we can make efforts for cessation of hostilities, efforts to get in humanitarian access to areas that we are unable to reach. In every single conflict, it's important. And restoring basic services, whether it's water, which is so critical for Gaza, hygiene, these are important elements of UNICEF's program response across the globe. Access to healthcare, water, and basic social services.
Can I have a follow-up to the...
Sure.
May I? Just I want you also to ask you about the vigor in which the UN dealt with the question of Ukraine compared to other conflicts. We have seen more UN involvement in the Ukraine and so fast. How do you explain that too?
For UNICEF, I can clearly say for my region, Ukraine was the largest program I had before the war. We had a strong presence in the east. I had 4 or 5 sub-offices, so we were poised to respond. We had done some preparedness work, and we knew there were ability of our teams to respond quickly because we had sub-offices and were pre-positioned inside the country. So I would emphasize the importance of preparedness in any emergency crisis. And I think there's a lot we have learned on how we can respond more quickly if we prepare adequately. With respect to, has that made a difference in other crises? I think where we've had large-scale capacity to be able to respond is where we've had a strong local presence. I think in Ukraine, what has been distinct is the financial response has been extremely strong. And that goes without saying that for UNICEF, again, here we've not seen the same scale of response in all crises equally. And there again, I would say the first crisis in Afghanistan, there was an equally strong response. So it puts a great onus, I think, on all of us, on you all as particularly, of how do we more strongly articulate the needs for children in any crisis, our commitment to leaving no child behind, on meeting the core commitments to children in every emergency. We're a 100% voluntary funded organization, so our ability to respond is based on our ability to raise resources. But our commitment to you is to make sure that every child, no matter what conflict or crisis, that their needs are put forward to the public and to governments to make sure that we're able to respond to the best extent we can.
Okay, Philippe?
Thank you very much. Philippe Rater from AFP. Coming back to Ukraine and adoption of kids in Russia, do you have an idea on how many kids were sent to Russia since February? And do you have an access to these kids in Russia? Thank you.
Thank you. I think the important part to remember about this issue of children and orphan children in particular, there were 91,000 children in closed facilities and institutions inside Ukraine before the escalation of the conflict. Many of these institutions were in the eastern part of the country. So we know that there have been reports of children crossing borders into Western Europe, as well as to the east, to the Russian Federation, as they've been attempted to be relocated in the crisis. In terms of exact numbers, we're working now with the government of Ukraine to see how many of the so-called children that are orphaned, because they're not orphans is the biggest main point I want to make here. Many of them have families. 50% of the children in closed facilities were there because there were children with disabilities, or there were other issues within the family that didn't allow them to care for their children. So we're working now to see how we can identify where there are legal guardians for these children, wherever they may be. Exact numbers I don't have. I have estimates from the Ukrainian government, but we have no ability to verify those numbers because we do not have access to the children across the border in the Russian Federation. So we've not been independently able to verify these reports, but we are making every effort to reach children across Ukraine with protection and assistance, and to make sure that where we know there are children that have been relocated from institutions, to provide support to those children, including through the capacity to support foster parenting where possible in other parts of Europe. But as I said earlier, I think any decision to move any child must be grounded in their best interests, and any movement must be voluntary. And parents need to provide informed consent. And ultimately, and this is why UNICEF is so much insisting on this issue, every effort must be made to keep families together. And while families are separated, maintaining family contact is critical. So this is work we have been requested to undertake by the government of Ukraine, and we're just in discussions with them now. And we're reiterating, including to the Russian Federation, that adoption should never occur during or immediately after emergencies, because children separated from their parents during a humanitarian emergency cannot be assumed to be orphans. So that family reunification focus will continue to be our focus. And in terms of accessing Russia, we will deal with the relevant authorities with whom we've had contact, and that includes the ombudspersons on child rights. But in terms of, as you know, being able to access Russia, this will be something we'd have to do in agreement with the government of the Russian Federation at their request, like we have for any other country where we've taken initiatives as a result of the Ukraine crisis.
Okay.
Thank you. Ray Bouchafra from Sky News Arabiya. Can you confirm reports from Russian authorities that say that many Ukrainian forces and militias are using schools as bases for their attacks and launch rockets against Russian forces? Thank you.
Have any confirmation of those details in terms of military action and schools being the point for launching of any offensive. What I can say is that we have seen schools that have been severely hit. We have seen schools that are now being used as shelters. And ultimately, I think that's why the Safe Schools Declaration and Ukraine signing that Safe Schools Declaration prior to the escalation of the conflict was very important, and we will continue to call on all member states to uphold that Safe Schools Declaration. It's the only way we can keep children safe, keep schools intact, and make sure that the attacks against schools and hospitals are no longer taking place.
If there are any other questions? Or any online? If not, I'd like to thank again our guest, Afshan Khan, the Regional Director for Europe and Central Asia of UNICEF. Thanks very much. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.